Aloha and welcome to the screencast on Bowfolios. This is, I think, the third one, and we're going to talk about the data model in Bowfolios, which is very interesting. I think you'll find it really useful to you as you start to, for your projects, come up with data models that are more complicated than a single collection, which is kind of what we've been dealing with up till now. So here we are in the Bowfolios application running locally. I've logged in. And the thing to note is that we have basically three kinds of entities that we're manipulating in the system. We have people who have a profile. We have projects, which are projects, and then we have interests like climate change, AI. And the important thing to notice is that when we display a profile, the important thing to notice is that they're all interconnected. Okay, so that a given person has interests in projects, a given project has associated interests in people, and given interests can be associated with both people and projects. Okay, so there's a many-to-many relationship, using database terminology, between all three of these things. And the question is, well, okay, great. How do you actually do this? Because the first thing you might be tempted to do when you define a person is to simply say, okay, here's a list of interests associated with this person, and here's a list of projects associated with this person, and then, bam, done. Super easy. I can get this page, no problem. But then imagine when you get to this page and you think, okay, how do I search through all the profiles for all the projects? And, it gets to be kind of more complicated as soon as you get away from the default case that kind of is the first thing that occurs to you. So the way that you want to do it, which kind of borrows from relational databases, and we'll kind of provide a design pattern for that in Mongo, is we're going to use these things which I call join collections. And so the idea is that in your profile, you specify things specific to profiles, and then you have two other collections that are related to profiles. One is this thing called profiles interests, where you have you have a set of documents, or you can think of them as columns or however you want, or where you have a given unique ID for a profile plus a given unique ID for an interest. And so all of the profiles, however many interests are associated with a profile will appear in this, and all of the profiles associated with an interest will appear in this one. Similarly, for profiles projects, that's going to represent our many-to-many relationship between profiles and projects interests, the many-to relationship between interests and projects. You'll see this in more detail in a second if that so far hasn't kind of cleared up the pain for you. But the idea is, given this table, we can search for a given profile and easily retrieve all the projects associated with it. Given this table, we can search, and similarly, we can search for a given project and find all the profiles associated with it. So we can search these join tables either along the first column for a given the first column, or search along the second column and get those entities in the first column. So you can search the first column, get all the second column, and vice versa. How does that manifest itself in reality? So think about this, okay? For projects, we want to know all the people associated with it. So what we can do is we can go to the project, this profiles projects, we can search for a given project like radgrad, and that will return all the documents for which radgrad is the project, and then you search the profile field of those documents, and now you know all of the people. Okay. Similarly, on this page, we want to know all the interests associated with this project. So we go to the project's interest, we search for the given project, we get a bunch of documents whose second element, which has a field more accurately in it, indicating the interests. And now we know what to display here for the interest field. Similarly, take any one you want, right? Now we can search on any of these things and build any combination or filter or slice and dice any way you want to. And it's very easy because now we have these three subsidiary collections which are being used to relate pairwise, create these pairwise relationships. Okay, so that's the good news, is when you're actually trying to query, now you have a super simple way to query. Of course, every benefit has a cost, right? And the cost is that now it's a little more complicated to actually build your data structure, because now when you update a profile or update a project or whatever, you may have to update these kind of auxiliary collections to make sure that they're representing things correctly. But well worth it, okay? Because the benefits in terms of representation and scalability and everything else are, and just debugging wise, it's, this is a much easier situation to debug than when you've got everything collapsed into one humongous document. All right, so the thing that I want to point out here that's very important, will become very important when you see how we actually build this thing, is that each of our primary collections, profiles, interests, and projects, all have a unique ID. Okay, for projects, the unique ID is the name, interest name is the unique ID, and profiles email is the unique ID, and that's necessary. We can't use the doc ID, it's going to turn out, because the doc ID will not always be known at the time we're actually trying to do an insert into these tables. But we establish a string that is guaranteed to be unique in each of these collections in order to make our queries. Okay, so let's now kind of look at how life works in this world. Remember that when we're starting up a server, we load the publications file, which is defining the publications, which we can use to retrieve, aspects of the various different collections. And we've got basically a publication for all of our different tables, both the, these join tables, as well as the join collections, as well as the primary collections. And then we also, if we go back to here, the second thing we're going to load is Mongo. Okay, and here's where things get interesting. So we're going to check, and I went through this in previous screencasts, but just to kind of remind you, what we do as we're executing this code is we check to see if the database is empty with a call like this, and then if it is indeed empty, we want to retrieve a field from the settings file associated with this Meteor run, and then do things with it. And remember that when we invoke Meteor, we're always using Meteor npm run start. That is because that indicates that we want to run the script called start in the package.json associated with this npm program. And that start script specifies a settings file, which is in the config directory called settings.development.json. So then we go here and we look here, and there are the fields with our default profiles and default projects, okay, all listed there. Okay. Now, some interesting things to note here. First is that I just got done saying that you don't want to just have interests and projects embedded as lists within your collection, because that makes things painful to actually query on, and that's I stand by that. But I didn't say that it might not be more convenient when creating the data structure to initialize your database to just pull these things together, right? So in fact, here I am embedding interests and projects inside the profile, but that's just a temporary thing. That this isn't the way it's actually represented internally. It's just a convenience function, convenience for actually building this thing. And also, I have to guarantee that if I specify a project like radgrad up here, that when I define a project down here, I better darn well define a project also called radgrad. Okay. Now, in the case of this simple example, I don't actually do the integrity checking to make sure that that happens. All right. And there are, definite ways to to do that. It makes the initialization a little bit less complicated if I just kind of have to manually ensure that I don't refer to things, I don't provide a unique ID here, right, which is what this is, that I don't later define. And you can imagine simple ways to check that. And then also it turns out, well, okay, so let's go back to our Mongo initialization, all right? And what you can see is that we're going to call this add profile, okay? And so when we add profile, we'll get the first name, last name, bio, we'll get all this stuff out, including, you know, projects and interests out of here. So we create the user, and then we, so that makes sure that this guy actually exists. We can log in as this person to the system. And then we're going to insert into the profiles collection, you know, the basic data. And then for each interest in this list, we're going to call insert of that interest, into the join collection. We're going to add a document that associates this email, the unique ID of this user, with this interest. Okay. And then for the profiles projects, we're going to call insert with the profile and the project name. Okay. And then we're going to define the interest. Okay. So the interest is just the interest name. Okay. Similarly, for projects, when we get to those, we're going to define the project, and we're going to map through the interests and use this join collection to associate the particular interest that we've added with the name of the project. Okay, and then we're going to add those interests. Now you may say, wait a second, interests are going to appear multiple times. Are you going to end up with a whole bunch of duplicate interest definitions? And we won't, because we're actually using the upsert method on the interest collection. So we're doing an update, not an insert, and we use this upsert thing to say, hey, define this thing if it hasn't already been defined. Otherwise, set it, and that way we guarantee that there's not multiple interests with the same name. Okay, I've talked about this assets thing in a previous screencast, so I won't go over that again. But as you can see, this is the way we're going to go through and start with this data structure here, okay, which kind of collapses certain things. So there's no join collections in this, and in fact, there's no definition of interests either. We're going to only define profiles and projects. Interests are just going to be implicitly defined because all interests are a string. Okay, so there's no need to have a separate definition of interest. We can just define them when we see them. But we do, when we're defining our profiles, want to say, okay, you know, here's the projects that are associated with this profile. And similarly, when we define a project down here, we're going to specify the interests associated with it, right? And all these kind of relationships are bidirectional. So, you know, given that we specify the people associated with a project, we don't in the projects have to now just define the people associated with it. You know, it's just once we've done it once, it's a bidirectional relationship, and we don't have to do it twice. Okay, so that is the way we run these things, and let's now take a look at Studio 3T. I want to do that just so that, you know, to kind of help you really visualize exactly what's happened. So here is a representation of the interest collection in MongoDB. Studio 3T is a free software you can get, or there's a free version of it. And it's very useful for visualizing. So I've just connected to the localhost 3001, which is the local version of Mongo that's running. And you can see that the interest collection, we have, you know, the doc ID, which we're basically not going to use at all in this system. We're going to not worry about it. But here's all the different interests. For profiles, you can see we have the name, first name, last name, bio, title, picture, and email. Okay, and we don't really worry about the doc ID because we're going to use email as the unique ID to search for this person. Profile interest collection. Now you can see really clearly what this collection looks like. And you can see that if we search, for example, for all of the interests, this is profiles interest. So what are all the interests associated with Philip Johnson or Johnson at Hawaii.edu? We do a find on the profile field for Johnson at Hawaii.edu, and we get back 2 documents. And the interest field of the first document is software engineering. The interest field of the second document is climate change. So now I know that Johnson has 2 interests. And you can do the same kind of thing for Cam Moore or anybody else. But you can also search, you can also ask the question, who's interested in software engineering? And then you search on this column for all the interest associated with software engineering, and you'll get back one document where the profile is Cam Moore, and another document where the profile value is Johnson at Hawaii.edu. So now you've determined who are the people who are interested in a specific interest like software engineering. And we can do the same thing for projects. Okay, what are the projects that Henry Casanova, we search down, we see he's only associated with one project, Wrench. However, Johnson is associated with 2 projects, RadGrad and Open Power Quality. Okay, and then for projects we can search for Open Power Quality, and we get back, Anthony Christie is one of them, and Serge Negrashov is another one. Okay, so that's how this, hopefully by now it's all starting to click for you. You're seeing how these join collections make querying super easy. Here's what the projects collection looks like. This is also kind of a little ad for having a decent user interface for inspecting your MongoDB database on the server. It just makes life easier to see that how things actually are, and when you're initializing your collections, are things occurring the way you want them to. Here's the join collection that relates projects to interests. Same old. Okay, so there you have it. Studio 3T showing you what's in the Mongo relationship. Last thing we want to talk about though is, fine, hopefully at this point you got okay, great, we got this default data, I understand the data model, I understand how we're loading data from this settings file and transmogrifying it into the set of collections, join collections and regular collections. Yeah, that's all fine, but wait, how does it actually get over to the client to be displayed in the browser? So let's talk about that for a second. Okay, let's go back here and before we go there, let's go through the same kind of process about how things start up, but this time we're going to focus on the client side, right? So we've got to load this startup client startup, so that creates our DOM thing, and what else are we going to, we're going to call methods, okay, and we're going to load bootstrap and style.css, and once we display, so when we start up, we're going to load the app thing, we go to layouts app.jsx, okay, and when there's nothing on the path, we're going to go to the landing page. So let's actually go to this landing page. And what I want to note is we talked before, there's publications and subscriptions. We've talked about that, so I'm not going to kind of start from scratch with that, but I want you to notice that there are no subscriptions associated with this page. Okay, so one thing that's really nice to do is to use this tool called Meteor DevTools Evolved. Let me just type it in for you. Meteor DevTools Evolved. Okay, so I highly recommend that you load this free package into Chrome. Okay, and once you've loaded it, what you'll notice is that if we're on the landing page and we click this Meteor button from Meteor DevTools Evolved, right? And then let's click on Mini Mongo. That's the one that's really kind of the one very interesting one. And it's very hard to see, but you'll see that Mini Mongo has we've defined collections for all these different kinds of things, but there's 0 documents in each of these things. So in the interest collection, there's nothing. Profiles, nothing. Profiles, interest. That's because on this page, we haven't subscribed to anything. Okay? But let's now go to the profiles page. Okay? And what you'll see now is that there are profiles. The profiles interest collection is there. There's no projects interest collection, but there is profiles projects. Okay? So if we go back to the source code for this page, which is the home page, okay? What you're going to see is that we have, as part of this page, we're subscribing to 5 publications, okay? And these subscriptions result in Mini-Mongo being populated by documents, okay? So if you notice projects interests, there's nothing in there, nothing in that collection, and that's because there's no projects, there's no subscription. We're not subscribing to anything in the project interest collection because on this page, right, we don't care about the relationships between projects and interests. All right, that's not important. Of course, if we go to this page, okay, now the project's interest collection is important because we want to find out for a given project what are the interests. Okay, on the other hand, you know, the interest collection, we're not subscribing to that anymore because we don't care. And profiles interest, we don't subscribe to that. Okay, so you know, parenthetically, using Meteor DevTools Evolved is a really nice thing to do as a way of, you know, figuring out, are we actually, you know, what's happening on the client side, and to what extent does the client side reflect the data that exists on the server when we inspect it, you know, using something like Studio 3T. So this is the server side, and then here's the client side. Okay. Now I want to note that you know, another parenthetical thing to note is if we go back now to the landing page, all these collections are dumped out. But if we go back here, you know, the subscription starts again and we get the data. And so some of you, you know, the more astute among you might be saying, boy, there's got to be a performance overhead with, you know, dumping this data and reloading it. And that seems, you know, like there's a scalability issue. And I will say that in the event that you start to manipulate large amounts of data and you want to, you know, worry about this issue, there is this thing in Meteor called subscription caching, which enables you to, you know, once you've got some data, kind of keep it around when you're navigating between pages in order to avoid the overhead of, you know, having to always reinitialize the local Mini-Mongo database with a page. And that's very, very simple to do. I don't do it in these prototype systems because it adds a little bit of extra, you know, code that you have to understand. And, you know, when you're dealing with just, you know, dozens or a couple hundred objects, you know, things are so fast that it, you know, you don't notice, right? So there's an old saying, you know, premature optimization is the root of all evil. Okay, very famous. Don Knuth, I think, was the one that said that. And so, yeah, don't optimize until you need to. Right now, the system is blazingly fast. You know, there's like no delay when you retrieve any of these pages. So there's no point in worrying about this overhead of retrieving a dozen objects. Okay, it's better to have less code that you have to read and understand and think about than to have this happen a few milliseconds faster. That said, you know, it will be a problem for certain systems as the number of objects grows, and at that point, you know, you figure out the mechanisms that are available, and I can assure you, because we use it in another project, that the subscription caching you know, takes care of those details. Okay, one final thing I want to go over in this is this idea that we need to have a unique ID, right? So the email field, the name field, and the name field, those must be unique. And because if we had two projects with the same name, then everything gets messed up, right? How do we do the right relationships? And as you think about it, you realize, well, one of the reasons why, building our initial set of join tables was so easy is because we didn't need to know the doc ID. So we could, just put these strings in and, hope that later on, the actual project would be defined. So by the time, everything's running and, we finished populating these collections, even if we provided a project name here early on in initialization, we weren't checking at that point to make sure that it would exist. So again, there's oftentimes you might have a final pass for integrity checking over the database if you're kind of building things in this way to make sure that you haven't mistyped a string in one of these things. But the other question is, what about these unique IDs? Can we enforce their uniqueness? And indeed we can. So for example, if you go to the interests collection, in the schema, we have this field unique : true. And that guarantees that when we insert a new document into this collection, that this field name, whatever value we have for it, doesn't already exist in the collection. And we do that for all these guys. So profiles.js, you can see that the email field has unique true, and then projects, we go here, we can see unique true, right? Okay, so that's how we get our unique IDs, but you can notice for projects interests, we definitely don't do that, right? Because in these join fields, we are gonna have, documents with the same project. In fact, that's the whole point of it, so we can have this many-to-many relationship. So there's times it's good, times it's not good. All right, I hope that has helped you understand the data model in Bowfolios, and I will see you next time.